Bachelor of Urban Forestry at the University of British Columbia and continues to work as a consulting arborist in Victoria, BC. Ryan has been practicing arboriculture and urban forestry since 2004 and is engaged in that work in Central Ontario, London, UK, and on British Columbia's south coast. His experience spans municipal, commercial, and nonprofit sectors, where he has supported small and large teams as a practitioner and a coordinator. Ryan currently serves as a volunteer as the president of the Garry Meadow Preservation Society and is a member of the International Society of Arboriculture's Credentialing Test Committee. Please welcome Ryan Senechal.
Hello, and thank you. I'm a bit of a wanderer, so I'm just going to move this out of the way. Thank you for the introduction, and nice to see you all tonight to talk about Garry Oaks and Garry Oak ecosystems, but with a bit of a slant in that we're going to hone in on the urban context. So a lovely view of Playfair Park, and behind me in the canvas, Meadow. Hopefully you all have had a chance to get out there and see it in all its glory. It'll be coming soon enough. There we go. A bit about me. I'm a generalist, really. I kind of have toes in several different areas. I get bored of doing one thing all the time. I like seeing all sides and how they integrate with each other, both in academia, where I work at UBC. I'm also engaged in research. My research area of expertise is in workplace behaviors, specifically with arborists and urban foresters. I've also been working more recently on a tree biomechanics project, which I'll talk about as a case study, just something to watch out for potentially coming to Victoria with climate change. In addition to that, in a volunteer capacity, I support community efforts. I really believe that community holds a lot of the answers to our biggest problems, and collaboration with institutions like local governments, regional governments, provincial governments, and so on. And of course, my work with credentialing and qualifications with arborists. I believe pretty strongly in quality objectives, but also safety objectives for workers that are out there climbing trees and interacting with trees in various capacities. I also grow trees separate from Garry Oaks. Arbutus is kind of my specialty, and I have a nursery at home where I grow arbutus from local ecotype seeds for urban restorations. A brief outline of what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to give you a bit of background about the Garry Oak Meadow Preservation Society. Following which we'll talk about some facts. Again, I'm a generalist, I'm not a biologist, so I'm not going to go on a deep dive here. I can certainly point you in the direction of those references, but we'll go over some interesting facts you may not have known about Garry Oaks and Garry Oak ecosystems. And then we're going to talk about some urban forest measurements. We're going to look at some recent work done in the city of Victoria. Here we are in Rockland, and we'll look at work that's happening to understand what's going on, big picture. I've got a few examples to share with you there. And finally, we're going to talk about trees and development. It's a bit of a big beast. It's a big policy dispute ongoing, and I'm going to talk about what's going on from my perspective as a consultant, also as a grower, as an advocate, and I've got some suggestions on how maybe we can move forward to get through this impasse we seem to be stuck in, and many communities are stuck in. Too far. Background on Garry Oak Meadow Preservation Society. We're a 100% volunteer-run charitable society. Our area of focus is really South Vancouver and primarily Saanich Peninsula, Victoria, Oak Bay, Esquimalt, and wading into Langford. We now have a mayor and council that are a bit more supportive of urban forest objectives. So we've had some conversations and engaged with that policy group. So I'm excited about the future and reducing We're dedicated to preservation, protection, and restoration of Garry oak stands, individual trees and stands, natural areas, trying to preserve as much as we can, but also restore degraded sites as well, and providing information to guide that. Improving the availability of local ecotype. Does anybody understand what local ecotype means when I say that? Local ecotype seedlings for replanting efforts, maintaining a diverse genetic stock of locally collected acorns from locally adapted Garry oak trees. We also hope to share the knowledge and provide support for all matters around care of Garry oaks, preservation of Garry oaks, advocating for Garry oaks, and Garry oak ecosystems. On the Garry Oak Meadow Preservation Society Board of Directors are a well-rounded group that bring a range of skills and skill sets and experience and professional backgrounds into our advocacy efforts, including people that worked in provincial government, local governments, that have registered professional backgrounds, biologists, foresters, and so on. So the Gulps Nursery is located on the Pape Highway between Sayward and Tanner. I've got an aerial view here. You can see we're tucked in behind this house just off the Pape, and it is a CRD property that backs onto Bear Hill. We use up a very small amount of the property. We don't grow field stock, we only grow in containers. Our footprint is fairly small, as you can see. There's a couple of trailers for our tools and our fridge for our acorns. The acorn selection itself is dependent on community members contributing their acorns that they collect. When you're verifying that it's a Garry oak tree and the tree's in good health and condition. I'm making some notes of the area that the acorns are collected from, marking it on the bag you gather them from. And if you can actually wash the acorns ahead of time, you can do what's called a float test. And the oak acorns that sink to the bottom are generally viable, and the ones that float are not, so you can separate them out, along with any acorns that have weevil damage. So you'll see entry holes through the husk of the acorn, and those are less than ideal, we find. So we receive all these acorns in bags to the nursery. Nursery volunteers will prep that seed, throw it in the refrigerator, wait for the time where root radical emerges, and then volunteers will go through and prep soil in pots and pot them up. Garry oaks are a masting species, so there's a cycle of kind of a bumper crop year. That was the year before. Generally, in my experience, and I haven't been around for so many mass cycles this is fairly anecdotal and based on the observations from others, it seems as though the intensity of that last year may have caused a total crop failure due to not enough energy. And this can be impacted further by extended periods of drought. Potentially the heat dome from the previous year could have exhausted further energy. So there's a lot to take into consideration. And the heat dome did, for reference, impact most of the Garry oak area. Its growing regions, which extend as far south as Oregon and into Washington. So competing theories, but hopefully we'll see some acorns this year, and you can collect them and bring them to us at the nursery, and we can get them potted up to maintain that the diversity in the genetic stock of local ecotype acorns.
Can we get that information on our website, on the Rockland Neighbourhood, so that we can collect those acorns and know where to bring them in?
Yeah, we can provide that to you. And our website is garryoak.info, and we can share that after as well. So volunteering opportunities at the nursery include, as I mentioned, work with the acorns and potting up. But there's also a fair bit of maintenance. Just in once things are growing and going, it's potting up. They are very vigorous rooters, tap rooters in particular. So we're trying to avoid root-bound conditions in pots. We want to have trees that are successfully integrating once they're planted out into the open. So that requires some labor through the volunteers, both in the pruning of roots and potting and making soil blends and so on. So we rely pretty heavily on the inputs of motivated volunteers. If anybody's interested in volunteering as well, I'd love to pass on information. Our work parties are generally Sunday mornings from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. And depending on the time of the year, there's different things going on. Even through the winter, there's usually things that are happening. Just briefly, the left side, you'll see there's a couple of different nursery containers. One of the things I'm interested in is looking at best practices and how we're propagating oaks in containers, noting that their roots are very vigorous and tend to circle in the bottom of pots. That gives us some headaches when we try and actually integrate them out in the open. So looking at different pot technologies, you see this dimpled pot to the side. It's called a mirror pruning pot. So we get involved in some trials, testing out different technology that's out there to get better results from the plants. We want the end user to have ideally trees that are going to succeed. So we're exploring the use of that pot. They do come with a greater expense, of course, but if it's less labor for the volunteers, then that's a win. Into some oak and Garry oak ecosystem facts.
Sorry, before you move on, can I just ask, where did the trees go? So the trees that you grow,
Where do our trees go?
how do you decide where they go?
How do we decide? Really, it comes from requests from members out in the community. They can be individuals, they can be property owners, they can be residents, renters. If they have a space where they can accommodate an oak, we want to help get that oak situated. So we offer oaks by donation for individuals or groups or larger restoration sites. They also go to municipalities, as I mentioned. Our partnership with the City of Victoria means they're entitled to about 10% of our yield. They don't always take it, but District of Saanich is also a big supporter. They purchase quite a number of seedlings from us each year. Generally, District of Saanich and Victoria are both using these trees, which are fairly small. They're like 1 gallon, 2 gallon containers. So they're getting planted out quite small compared to what you would be used to with street trees, for example, where they're being planted at about 6 centimeter caliber and 3 meters tall. These smaller ones tend to be a better fit for natural areas where they're not going to be trampled or hit by a car and those sorts of things. So Garry oak, the Senechal name, I think it's pretty important that we provide these names, given the importance of the oaks to Saanich and Lekwungen people, that we understand the name that they assign to it. And I've given the pronunciation for you here, so you can give it a shot. And there are a couple of videos. Tiffany Joseph has done a fair bit of work on language, particularly around plants. She's provided some.
One more time, please.
And Arbutus is Quercus. So there's a couple you can know, and you can say its name when you see it next time, and it'll be embedded in your mind. Garry oak ecosystems. Speaking of Coast Salish nations, the Senechal language group, Lekwungen speaking peoples have shaped the Garry oak system over thousands of years through agroecological in the rain shadow here, we have Garry oaks and meadows, largely due to this fire management. The population of oaks is connecting First Nations people to their culture, and as we continue to fragment through development, that needs to be known, and we need to advocate for their access, for knowledge sharing to occur, the connection to ancestors, particularly at old oaks. There are several oaks in Victoria that are pre-settlement and maybe not cared for as they could be. We could be restoring those for maximum benefit for First Nations people. Speaking botanically, Garry oak is in the Fagaceae family. It is of the genus Quercus. Its flowers are inconspicuous, that being small. Both male and female flowers are on the same tree, but are separated. The male flowers are catkins, and pollination occurs through wind, not through insects. The largest oak, has anybody been to the Falkland oak? It's pretty amazing. It's largest in girth in the region. Urban. As we head across the Malhats up into in around Maple Bay, the champion, the big boss tree is up near Maple Bay. And that's by volume, taking the girth of the tree, but also its overall mass. But this one on Falkland is a chunky trunk. I believe about 2.8 meters. And you can see it right from the road. You can pull up next to it and go give it a hug. When did Garry oaks arrive in the region? About 10,000 years ago with the retreat of the glacier. They're some of the rarest ecosystems in Canada and in the US. Their range is very narrow. The conditions that allow it to thrive are very specialized. We're in this rain shadow on South Vancouver Island where they thrive. Deeper soils are ideal, but they tend to do just fine on rocky outcrop and exposed slopes. Garry oaks, as it turns out, are one of the most adaptable species to anticipated climate change for this region. That's for urban conditions as well. The tree has found itself on Metro Vancouver's climate adaptable tree species list, which was produced a few years ago with a multi-stakeholder committee that considered all the factors with available trees that both introduced and native species that do well in the region. So Garry oak holds a lot of promise for providing the ecosystem services, that being the benefits that we can use in terms of shade provision, for example. At least 1,600 organisms have co-evolved. Over 100 organisms are endangered that rely on Garry oak for some part of their life cycle. There's your Garry oak facts. We're going to talk about urban forest management. So I already talked about climate change briefly and how that's really shaping the narrative around urban forest management. And I wanted to feature a couple of mapping projects that are occurring and apply it through a Garry oak lens, if you will. I've taken City of Victoria's public tree inventory data, some of which is made public. What I have here is a snapshot of 33,000 trees that are on public lands within the municipal boundaries of Victoria. And I've amassed that information and broken it into different species groups, and we can have a look at what kind of foothold Garry oaks have within the public tree database. So this inventory was initially conducted in 2013 by a team of contractors that came in to support City of Victoria. They provided this initial snapshot of 33,000 trees in 2013 and handed it over to the city. The city arborists now maintain this resource. So anytime they attempt to perform an inspection or perform maintenance on a tree, they're updating the inventory in some capacity. Usually the diameter of the tree, the condition of the tree, but also it functions as an asset manager for the city. So they gather some additional information, just demonstrating that they're providing care to the trees. So within that inventory of public trees, Garry Oak have about 14% of the inventory, and that's primarily due to Beacon Hill Park, Topaz, Summit. Those are the largest collections of Garry Oak on public lands. They don't make up a huge proportion of street trees as compared to their presence in natural areas and parks in the city. As you can see, a close second is an introduced species, the cherry plum, which are not expected to be all that adaptable to anticipated climate change in the region. So that is something to keep in mind as I'm doing a little foreshadowing here for what's coming here in the presentation. Of this list of species here in the top 10, we've got Garry Oak, Douglas fir, and bigleaf maple is the only local species to this area. The rest are all introduced. That's what the public-facing GIS or inventory looks like. You can go and access this through Victoria's Open Data Portal. And if you click on any, well, you probably want to zoom in a little bit first, but if you click on any one of these dots, each one represents a tree. And you can access the basic information about the tree by clicking into it. You'll get the species, the location of the tree. It has an asset number, it's kind of like a phone number for the tree, and the diameter. And those are only public trees in that feature. Looking at the Garry Oaks specifically within the public tree inventory, I've broken up the size into 3 different categories on this tree map, just to show you how few trees remain in the large mature category. So 80 centimeters diameter, just under 3 feet diameter at breast height. There's 409 trees remaining. That's in the whole of City Victoria and all its natural areas. If I were to bump that up to 100 centimeters, that would drop down surprisingly far as well. So most of the composition of age and size of Garry Oaks in Victoria is in this 0 to 79 centimeter category. And that is also an underlying point which is going to show up later in this presentation, just talking about the composition and our vulnerability with the difference in age and size classes. So larger oak trees are heavyweights for wildlife. This needs to be more of a focal point. There's been some attention to biodiversity this year through the summit in the winter. There was briefly a little bit of focus on the importance of biodiversity, and some of the municipalities were talking about it in their natural areas programs. 409 trees remain that are providing the kind of benefits that larger birds and mammals are seeking. They're very specialized and adapted to these trees, and the range has narrowed. There's a lot of competitions for space, as we know, throughout the region, and deforestation occurring through larger developments, sprawl occurring, and so forth. But within the community, there's also a hesitance to retain these trees as they age and they get large, and what happens as trees get old. Parts of them fail, So there's risk perception concerns and fear concerns around Garry oaks and their parts failing and potentially causing injury or property damage. So there are places where that is certainly warranted, but often we apply blanket responses to these types of issues, like trees in natural areas. As they decline and maybe even die, the urge may be to remove it, replace it, rather than retain some of its benefits, which may last in situ for decades to come, even as the tree is dead and crumbles away slowly over time. So one particular project on the left-hand slide here, while I was still working in a supervisory capacity with the City of Victoria, we had identified a tree through our risk assessments and inspections and done some decay detection on the base, and the tree had serious decay, and it did not pass our threshold for retaining trees. However, it was in a low traffic part of the park, and we all on our crew understood the benefits for wildlife, and you could look around this tree, we can't see from a distance so well, but the one stem to the right had about 9 or 10 nesting holes in it, just on one stem, on multiple sides. It had become like a cavity nester's hotel. So you think about all the structure in a huge old tree like that, and how long it's taken to form, and how unique little hiding holes have formed. That is really precious in the area, in a wide buffer around it. There aren't many trees like that on private property because people don't want to accept that risk. And trees do fail. But this was the perfect location where we could really get behind it. So we approached it asking to effectively install a split rail fence. It's kind of a soft barrier to keep people out of the hazard area. So it took a little bit of work and getting some assistance from the community to persuade for it as well, but together we got there. And a part of the tree did fail, but it's still continuing to be occupied. There is, every year there's barred owl chicks, 1 to 2 chicks that have been fledging under the tree, and regular check-ins, there's lots of activity in the tree. So identifying these trees and rather than removing them, and there are opportunities on some private properties as well to do the same, rather than just remove the problem. Yeah?
Can we get help somewhere to assess a large tree that might be in jeopardy?
Absolutely.
We just contact you folks?
Yeah.
Bring us things.
So this is one of the services we provide is running sort of dispatch for these types of functions. So if you have a specific Garry Oak related issue, contacting us through our email address, we can, if it's not something we do within our group, we definitely can point you in the right direction. Okay, now on to LiDAR. Is anybody aware of how LiDAR is used to measure the urban forest? We've got a couple in the crowd. So what LiDAR is light detection and ranging. It's typically a remote sensing equipment that is mounted on aircraft, sometimes drones, sometimes satellites. The high resolution variety that we're using for urban forest measurements is typically flown on an aircraft. And rather than taking photographs, it's bouncing light off of the surface, and it measures the time that light takes to return to the sensor. And it creates effectively like a volumetric map of the surface. So we can get height information. You get different reflection signatures off of different species of trees, and trees versus grass versus soil versus hard surfaces and buildings. So it allows you to use software then to separate those different categories or cover classes and measure them. And that's often what is being produced now to get an understanding of what your canopy density is as the whole neighborhood by neighborhood in the case based on the method that Victoria used. LiDAR technology is now being more often equipped on vehicles, and they're working on new technologies through research to perform urban forest measurements, including automated inventory of trees, street trees. We'll just measure and identify and geolocate these trees. So you think about the amount of time saved for someone like myself, trudging out, doing notes for one tree at a time in a city when a vehicle can do it automatically and just work a grid. There's a lot happening in the LiDAR space right now. But for the sake of this discussion, we're just looking at an aircraft, looking down, and determining those different cover classes to understand how much canopy we have. So the report that was produced and released in around 2021, I believe, produced a comparison. It measured historic's not the right word, but on a temporal scale, it took LiDAR flights that occurred in 2013 and also 2018 using a similar method. Similar resolution of the images that were collected as well. So they were able to do an apples to apples comparison. We wanted to know what was going on in terms of the development specifically was the number one issue at the time, like how much of an impact is it having on the overall urban forest canopy. And what they found out of that report was that Victoria's urban forest grew across all neighborhoods that were measured, which I was quite surprised by. The overall density was measured at 559 hectares, which amounted to, compared to all the other cover classes, a 28% overall canopy density. It estimated total public and private trees at about 150,000. Again, City of Victoria's public tree inventory, which is pretty thorough, has 33,000 trees. So that gives you about 25% on public lands and 75% of that population on private property. The report also notes the maximum potential canopy that can be realized is about 38% for Victoria. Lisa Helps provided a press release following this technical report being distributed in internal staff. This technical report was never made public. I sought it through an FOI. This analysis demonstrates we can continue to develop and grow as a city while also protecting and growing the urban forest necessary for public enjoyment and to address climate change and long-term resilience. So that conclusion is a bit of a stretch. And unfortunately, we don't have the technical report on the website to dive in and see what is being said by the person performing the analysis. But I've pulled some key points out here. We're just going to do a little bit of deeper analysis to consider that statement. This is probably the key. The statement at the bottom, the horizontal growth of existing vegetation offsets the effect of vegetation lost from urban development or die-off. So trees give us this compounding benefit. As trees get larger and larger and growing conditions are good, there will be a period in their lifespan where their horizontal and vertical growth is at its peak. And you think of all the overall branching on a tree in that collective expansion. I think what is most striking is when you compare a tree being removed with a proportional replacement of smaller trees, and it really helps you appreciate how much mass is in that canopy of the larger tree. tree that was destined for removal in Langford. And it had about 210 meters square. I just did an area calculation rather than a volume calculation. And for a proportional replacement based on the size of trees you could actually find in a nursery, it would require 80 trees to replace that canopy at the time of planting. Taking a smaller set, I looked at about 13 trees being planted and required 15 years of growth to achieve that parity of the tree that was lost. So when they say the horizontal growth of existing vegetation offsets the effect of vegetation loss, that's thinking of green space like Beacon Hill Park, especially, and how many trees and how many large trees are in that space. But those benefits are not necessarily at the local level for neighborhoods beyond Beacon Hill. Here are the individual measurements for the different years that were measured. What it's calling vegetation cover is they measured everything that was at least 2 meters height and higher. So yes, there is some understory plants that probably would have been included in this. It's more understood as being a canopy survey, but there could be some ocean spray or taller shrubs that are in the mix, and invasive species in particular, blackberry and ivy. But we can see the percent change from each neighborhood. I'm sorry, the font is so small. If anybody wants to see this information, I'd be happy to share it with you as well. But we do have the individual vegetation in hectares in each category, which gives you some perspective on how it's not proportionally shared from each neighborhood. So as the technician provides their interpretation of the results, we see a bit of a disconnect from the political level summary that was provided in the press release. It will be of importance to monitor the continual changes in the city's vegetation canopy to assess whether the fill-in growth of existing and new plantings will continue to outstrip vegetation loss. So it's not assured, is what I'm getting from the technician. Further to ongoing monitoring, determining age class, distribution, and species composition will help to forecast vegetation growth trends and potentially predict when vegetation growth will cease to offset losses. It's a bit of a cautionary tale. Can you appreciate how we become vulnerable when the age distribution gets out of balance? When we have many trees that are nearing end of life, we end up in potentially a boom and bust situation where we lose an abundance of canopy all at once. That is not known on private property what we're dealing with. We've got a better sense of what's going on within the public tree inventory thanks to the gathering of the information of size of tree, both in crown spread and height, but also the condition of the tree. So that can give city maintenance crews some important perspective and help with the planning. Private trees, we don't really know.
Could we, you have all that LiDAR data, or the city has all that LiDAR data, so they could know if they wanted to do that analysis?
That was not captured within the scope of this assignment. Within LiDAR, we can get stress signatures off of within an individual species or a few different species. That's becoming more of a common scope for often cities that are already going through a major event, like Dutch Elm, like Emerald Ash. It's kind of their So the species composition, when I showed you that tree map with Garry oak being 14% of the species composition and the others in the top 10, it's the amount of trees within the top 10 is not ideal. It's not best practices. It leaves us vulnerable. Garry oaks are a bit of an outlier though because their range is so narrow and focused on the South Island. So what might be a disproportionate exposure to a species, in our case, there's a bit more nuance to it that needs to be considered. Threats to the canopy density. I don't think anyone could deny that development as is currently practiced is pretty hostile to ecosystems as well as individual trees, particularly oaks. They have large canopies, they have large roots spread on the larger the tree, the greater the distance the roots are traveling, and more likely to have conflicts with developments. Also capital projects, transportation, infrastructure, all these sorts of things. Cookie cutter design solutions and engineering solutions do not mesh well with tree protection. Climate change, higher heat, extending periods of drought, increasingly likely severe weather events are not great for trees that have been through development disturbance, construction injury, past wounding, past poor maintenance practices. They're vulnerable, and eventually we can end up in situations where we have large branch losses, horrible tree failure. Garry oaks are prone to root decay pathogen, and where we have a weakened anchoring structure and a wind event or a loading event, including rain or snow, we end up with tree failures. These are preventable through better management practices through the development process. Destructive insect populations and pathogeny. I mentioned at the start I'm engaged in some biomechanics research now, which has arrived due to the presence of the western limber moth in Burrard Inlet, wiping out the hemlock, western hemlock population. So up to an elevation of 150 meters all around Burrard Inlet, you see a big, what looks like a deciduous forest in the winter. It's mostly hemlocks that have lost all their foliage and have recently died, sort of altogether. So we've had 4 years of successive peak populations of the insect, which has exacerbated growing conditions that have been really stressful for the hemlock. Drought and high heat. So now the municipalities are dealing with a management crisis in their natural areas and parks with hemlock exposure. Hundreds, thousands of trees. Stanley Park, probably the most high-profile example of this. They just commissioned a management plan not only to identify the extent of the loss, but plan whole restoration event and plan contractor relations and everything. This is a serious disruptive event, and will have impacts that are measurable using LiDAR analysis to the overall canopy in that area and the benefits that it's providing. So we are vulnerable. It needs to be taken into consideration when we start making politicized statements about the root forest being resilient. We should be planning, we should be investigating ways that we can build resilience without just looking for measurements to validate it. The earth is constantly shifting and we need to stay ahead. So poor age and species composition, as I mentioned, and the loss of plantable space through development and infrastructure improvements is a major challenge. District of Saanich just released a State of the Urban Forest report, and And at multiple points in the report, they mentioned that plantable space is a major hangout for them. They have many planting ambitions, but you can't just shovel all of your planting efforts into parks. You need to distribute those trees into neighborhoods where those benefits can be distributed at the local level.
Right?
Yes?
Didn't staff just cut down a whole lot of Garry oaks in an area that was thought to be maybe someday that could be a conservation area, but they wanted to build it?
Oh, I think you're probably referring to the Swan Lake situation.
Maybe, I'm not sure where it was.
Yeah, that's a whole separate presentation. Yeah, that's speaking of just aligning community partners and working together on these issues. One really positive thing that's come out of this event where a development permit was approved on an area that had previously been classed a sensitive ecosystem and had protections up until 2017 preventing that type of development. The development was approved despite loads of pushback from the community, but the story's not quite over yet. There's been a lot of discussion back and forth about the impacts on the watershed and the collective loss of canopy and area oaks on the property. But there are many other situations just like it, these large-scale developments in particular. Guys?
Development 1 Fourth Street.
Pardon?
Development 1 Fourth Street. Yeah, well,
So are they susceptible to the gypsy law?
Are oaks susceptible? So we're calling it spongy moth. It's had a name change. They are, and they've been anticipating windows where the population will peak, and that's generally when the aerial sprays occur. It's for spongy moth. Unfortunately, the aerial sprays are non-selective and can be damaging to beneficial populations of Lepidoptera, or caterpillars and moths. Winter moth is another damaging one, but one that has been around for a long time, and they seem to do just fine. They'll lose a lot of foliage through the chewing injury from the insects, but they tend to recover. But if there's several other stressors, it can be the last nail in the coffin. Looking at plantable areas, two that I've highlighted that stand out are Harris Green and downtown. So that's a 15% loss of plantable area in 2013 to 2019, and Harris Green is 21% loss. So those are distant early warnings that we're not seeing in the high-level report on the city's page, and that should be cause for pause and discussion about how are we going to achieve canopy equity? How are we going to provide those local level benefits that are needed in a highly impervious place, high density urban place? So there's plenty of positive to see in there as far as plantable area, but we get to a caveat on the next slide. This is what it looks like from just their visual representation of the data. They just color coded what the software is picking up as plantable. What do you notice about the plantable spaces?
All school grounds.
School grounds, what else? Parks. Are parks easy spaces to plant trees in? They're highly contested spaces. There are many user groups that interact with those spaces. You're not going to just go in a forest right around a sports field, for example. There's going to be an awful lot of pushback. So that is acknowledged in the report. It should be noted that these numbers do not take into account plantable areas that would likely be unsuited to tree planting due to competing land uses such as recreation sports fields, underground or above ground utilities corridors. So I'm not sure why we included this perspective in the report. It's just kind of invalidated itself. It does point you in a direction where there's wide open spaces, and maybe one we can work on is improving our relations between institutions such as local governments and school district. School district doesn't have the budget to ramp up its planting, for example. Maybe we can find ways through community partners to support some expansion of those school grounds that use up a lot of maintenance of turf, are perhaps underutilized, but could provide local level benefits out to their community where the city doesn't own park space. The threats to plantable area, status quo development practices. We seem to accept that we're filling to the setbacks, filling to the lot line or the cut line, and if replacements can't be absorbed that are provided the minimum soil volume that the city of Victoria requires, well, you can cash out at that point. You can pay your cash limit for replacement trees, and that will go into the tree reserve, and hopefully those trees will get planted somewhere else. Above ground and below ground utilities, transportation infrastructure, and the engineering specifications required upon all of those functions can be immovable constraints. And guess what? Everything is planned, and we find out at the very end, this is the space we have for a tree. What do you think it amounts to? It's, as a consulting arborist, it's frustrating to be the last person in the process, and you get the last little scraps left over. I'm hopeful, and there are case studies of developers working in other communities where they're a little more motivated on these issues and they understand the benefits, where trees are provided good growing space, good soil volume, companion plantings, and how that can benefit the residents of the project ultimately and the neighbors. But we need more of those stories. The cost burdens of these improvements to development, whether it's retaining sections of an intact area ecosystem or individual trees, are not insignificant. It's the unfortunate truth, but we need to find ways through this, or we're going to continue to lose ground. I did mention in parks, you're competing with other user groups' desires for public space. That can include new parks acquisition that may appear to be a great potential to incorporate more urban forest. But ultimately, it's consensus finding to fit everybody into that little parcel. Public green space, particularly in Victoria, 27 kilometers square, bound by municipalities and topography and an ocean. We're not gaining green space. Any parks acquisition is occurring at market value, and that's super inflated at this point. So that cost to acquiring and maintaining parks is quite a burden. A quick look at the private trees and development situation in Victoria. The Victoria Tree Protection Bylaw was implemented. It's in its current state in 2021, but it is ultimately bound by Part 3, Division 7 of the Community Charter, which means that whatever the zoning allows for that lot, there's no physical protection for trees that fall within that. And that's not just the building lot line, but over excavation to accommodate safe worker entry to build forms and so on. It's a really frustrating impediment for me, my goals, and my work as a consultant. You frequently encounter like intact pieces of Community pushback seems to give some supports, but there's only so much we can do, unfortunately, and this is what we're just going through with Swan Lake yet again. Replacement requirements that are lacking physical space as a result of this community charter business is the double whammy. So we lose the trees in the first place, we lose future growing space, and they can cash out, and the city accepts those funds. We'll plant trees or use it for other urban forest functions, but unfortunately not in the situation that they've been removed from. Often with larger projects, we'll see some trees arrive on frontages that will be taken into the city's inventory and maintenance, but they're limited often by utilities and proximity to buildings and the actual soil volume that they're provided. However, City of Victoria has pretty ambitious private tree soil volumes in place now, probably the most of any municipality on Vancouver Island at this point, but not for public trees. $2,000 gets you your replacement tree with the city. So regardless of there being a ratio, whatever minimum number of trees are required for that lot, if there's not physical space, you pay the money, and I guess we don't really know where that money's going just yet, and perhaps this is a place that the community can ask for some transparency and potentially make recommendations on how these funds are to be used. My personal bias on this is that trees are being planted with appropriate soil volume in places where benefits are maximized where they are most needed. That being in neighborhoods that have been identified as having underserved by canopy. So Burnside, downtown, Harris Green. As I mentioned, Victoria's bylaws is quite robust, but we are limited ultimately by the community charter and Ohio order of government. And then now the rules of the game have changed with missing middle. So how does that impact the gains that we've realized through the tree protection bylaw that was quite ambitious in 2021? It's now been somewhat undermined in what it can accomplish. There will be a lot of cash in lieu exchanges happening. What is the strategy to compensate for that and get Garry oaks and other trees replaced in the neighborhoods where they're removed? And where do we go from here? So, key takeaways at this stage for me are looking at the living threats. I was involved in the Hurricane Fiona response. I provided immediate triage analysis and implemented procedures for the city of Charlottetown because they were not prepared for what had occurred and they were overwhelmed. More recently, with my involvement in this hemlock research project, we're utilizing trees that have recently died for biomechanics research because there are just so many trees that have died, and it's such a waste to not get some research benefit out of it. But those two loom large for me. What are we doing to prepare for living threats around climate change and pathogen and insect that may come in tow with a weakened population? Looking at compositional issues around age of the trees and species distribution. Can we as community members and residents do more? I think so. I sat in on a consulting arborist who, similar to myself, had kind of worn a couple of different hats, had been with the municipality, and then went out on the private sector. Was also demoralized at the loss of trees. She's based in Ottawa, and the story she shared could have been conditions that we experience here, sharing like stories that just sounded like, well, that was in the paper like yesterday in Victoria. So we're all going through a lot, but there's so much that we can benefit from each other, and sharing these good stories and research sources and highlighting success stories is really important at this stage. So participation, bringing your skills, your unique skill sets, your unique perspectives into the community urban forestry ring, showing up for the trees and for benefits at the local level is essential. Connecting with case studies, as I mentioned, and avoiding the public policy framing traps, dichotomies of housing being oppositional to trees and vice versa. We know the benefits that are provided, the social benefits, the health benefits. Why are we not incorporating trees in these developments? Why are we making trees the villain in this case? We need to push back hard on that and get urban canopy and all the benefits provided where they're at as this development is occurring. And don't hesitate to get political. I know it's intimidating and personal attacks and so on come to the forefront. But leaning in to support maybe people that are a bit more comfortable in entering that space can give them a little bit of wind in their sails as well. The nonprofits can use your help tomorrow, often in unique ways. Again, how you can share your unique skill sets and experiences to shape it. Most of these organizations are participating in community forestry in some capacity in the area. And we can certainly use your help at comps if you're interested. That's it. So I'm going to stick around and do some questions.
So are Garry oaks not protected at all? I mean, there seems to be this myth that Garry oaks are a protected species and that people can't just take them down.
So Garry oaks are protected in, depending on what capacity we're talking about. If we're talking about development, Garry oaks are protected, but not where they land within the zoning allowable of development. Not physically. They're protected for an exchange of replacement funds or planting ratio on the site. That's the extent of their protection.
So if somebody wanted to build a bigger house on their lot and it fell within the zoning regulations, which of course have changed recently for Missing Middle, they could take down a multi-limbed 150-year-old Garry oak and give somebody $2,000 to do that.
Yes, it's not necessarily going to be a cash and live situation. If they can fit tree replacements on the lot, then they'll allow that. But there's no protection offered to the tree itself. If it's a secondary suite or a driveway in Victoria, they'll ask for a design change generally. But if there's no way to accommodate a design change, the tree is unfortunately going to lose that height. As far as maintenance and damaging activities to a tree, Garry oaks are protected. So there is that. It doesn't, often it ends up in it's not necessarily a preventative situation. It just gives the city some tools to offset the losses if they need to remove and replace a tree that's been damaged.
In the logging, are there examples from other cities, from other districts where that zoning superseding everything else has been challenged and changed?
It's a bit of a rough time, a rough period right now. I think many of the discussion about, well, you know, we should be integrating canopy in the development if we're serious about the whole communities and weathering out climate change, like from an adaptation angle.
I know cedars are having a really tough time now, and what I'm curious about is why people don't water their trees. I mean, would Garry oaks benefit from being watered if they're looking stressed in the summertime? Same with cedars, like, yeah, why not water them?
So unfortunately, in some cases, if trees have been through construction injury, damage, if they're already on shallow soils or exposed sites, if there's been edge disturbance, say there's a stand of trees around it that have been removed or modified in some capacity, I can predispose them to a great deal of stress that's not going to be overcome by you supplementing with water. Younger trees, ideally, we would be providing water during periods of drought, but you know, we're up against water restrictions in some capacities and some, you know, looking at Salt Spring this year, that needs to be taken into account. So we need to be having conversations about, is this the right species for the situation? If we're seeing stand level decline in the case of Western Red Cedar, we ought to be thinking long term. Maybe we can slowly lead in a little bit through provision of water, but it needs to be adequate water, like surface treatment's just going to evaporate and so on. So yeah, it's a dilemma. I was noticing the cedar today. I was up in Cobble Hill earlier today and just noticing the amount of cedar decline there, even above and beyond last year. It's going to be quite noticeable this year.
Obvious signs of decay that experts could pick out.
Yeah, so the question is, any obvious signs of decay that a non-expert could pick up? And absolutely you can. Main indicator